Hey everybody, it's Mina 007 here for the penultimate episode of our Agatha Christie reread. Today we're going to be covering the last published Hercule Poirot story, Curtain, published in September 75 but written probably 30 years earlier. Today I am joined by a wonderful crew of podcasters. We have Adam.
Hey, this is Adam, also known as Drowned Snow.
We have Zander.
Zander, the Lord Baron.
And we have Pat.
2.0 in the Discord.
Lovely. So let's just start off with how you all came to the book and what you thought of it. So maybe in that same order again, Adam.
Yeah, this was the first time reading. So I read Murder on the Orient Express and Death on the Nile like years ago, which I reread in the last month or two. And then I read Endless Night.
Mm-hmm.
And then that was interesting. So I got into the Poirot short stories and stuff, and I did Mysterious Ferret Styles, Murder on the Lake. I probably did about half a dozen of them so far.
Oh, okay.
So, and then this one. So, because I was like, if we're doing this, I was like, I need something to contrast it with. So,
very good.
yeah. So this is very different. So I haven't read them all, obviously, but
yeah, it is dark and melancholy. We're not going to spoil it until the end credits music plays, listeners.
Yeah.
So you will be safe until then, but we will get into the twist. Did you like it?
I did. I wasn't quite expecting, where it goes, obviously, but it was nice. Like having only read kind of the first section of books, most of the books that Hastings is featured in, so it was kind of nice. Like, oh, Hastings is back, and it's sad that his wife is dead at this point. But
my faithful dog Hastings, he's so mean to Hastings in the book.
He's so mean. It's like, oh, if only you had more brains, Scarecrow kind of thing.
I know. I think people who only know this from the TV show are often surprised at just how nasty.
And so
Poirot
I
is
didn't
taken.
watch the TV show or anything. I've watched the movie adaptations for the recent ones. Kenneth Branagh's in that. I can't remember.
That's it. Yeah, it's his series.
Yeah, but I did last night. I went and dug this up, the TV episode for this, and I watched that.
Oh, great.
So I'd have something to compare it to, and since I hadn't watched any of those.
Well, it is the one and only adaptation that's ever been done. So interesting.
Yeah, it's on YouTube for free. So
yeah, excellent. How about you, Zander?
Naturally, being a Poirot one, I loved it.
Even
but
where it went. I was wondering if this would have you. Oh,
so
excellent.
It's a very bittersweet story, which works fittingly, I think. But my sweet Hastings and my darling Poirot.
I think the one thing we can probably spoil in this section is that Poirot dies at the end of the novel. And the reason I think we can spoil it is because the Agatha Christie estate and the press spoiled it before the book was even published. It was a big fanfare to say that he wouldn't make it. So, yeah. How about you, Pat? Did you like it? Is it your first time reading it?
Yes, first time reading it. I enjoyed it, but it's probably only like a mid-tier Christie for me. It's got its problems, and I might be in the minority here, but I actually found myself laughing at quite a bit of it. Most of the comedy seems to come from Hastings.
Yeah,
so,
that's always the way, though, right?
Yeah, there's some brilliant moments, like when Hastings is talking about how Poirot's modesty hasn't changed right at the very start, and Poirot's getting some digs back as well, going, Hastings, you still got an eye for the ladies. I can see that, by the way that you've dolled yourself up and things like that. So I quite enjoyed those little moments. I thought the relationship between them, I mean, everybody's talking about it being abusive and everything, but there's quite a lot of affection between the two of them.
Oh, yeah, for sure. There's a lot of bants and a lot of genuine love, I think, for sure. I agree with you. I would say it's kind of top of mid-tier Christie, if that's very refined. Like, I don't think it's in anyone's top 10, but I do like it. I think it is very subtle and slippery and twisty. I remember very viscerally reading this for the first time as a young teenager, or maybe just before being a teenager, and being utterly shocked because I did not know any of the twists and being horrified. It was a big moment for me, and I've never quite forgiven it. And there are a lot of Christie fans who don't read it because they don't want to read about Poirot dying. But we'll get into it in the spoiler section about where the characters go and how far we follow them there. Okay, well, let's get into the spoiler-free bit. So this novel comes after Poston of Fate, which was the last novel published in Christie's lifetime in November, or the last one that she had written, November 73. So readers had a 2-year wait nearly before this came out. So you were no longer getting your Christie for Christmas. The setup of it is basically that we return to Styles Court, which was the setting of her first ever and very famous novel. But it's now, as is the case of many post-war country houses, been changed into a different use because people can't afford to run these Downton Abbey style houses anymore. And it's a guest house. And Poirot has invited Hastings back from the Argentine, and he is on the trail of someone he calls X. The setup is that he realizes there's a person who, a little bit like Othello and Iago, that there's a person who is manipulating others to commit murder. And Poirot has put together 5 of these murders, knows the person's going to be at Styles and wants to entrap them. But he won't tell Hastings who it is. But he needs Hastings' help as his body and his sort of arms and legs, because he is now incredibly old. He is confined to a wheelchair, and he has a new valet called Curtis who can like physically pick him up and carry him and move him around because he is no longer mobile, but the little grey cells are still active. So we are basically in a closed house mystery. We know that obviously someone staying at Styles is X. And at the very end of this novel, we will actually have a locked room mystery, which is quite unusual in Agatha Christie because a final murder will take place and it will be within a locked room. So that's the setup to the novel. Is it worth getting into some of the social change? It is a bit weird actually, because it's hard to know whether the social change refers to 1945 or 1975. But anyway, there is social change to be commented on here. Anyone got any examples they want to read out, or shall I run through my list?
I'm happy for you to go through your list. I mean, I was wondering how you're going to tackle this because it was quite clearly written and set much earlier than when it was published, which is unusual in the sort of the way we've been covering the Christie so far, because they tended to have been quite contemporary, and you've been able to mark it. Whereas I didn't really see any sort of imprint of the 60s or the 70s in this one. As I was flicking through it, it
Well,
did
I
seem to be.
kind of did a little bit, but yeah, it's mostly 40s. But I think when she
Yeah.
revised it before her death, maybe a few things crept in. But I think you're right. I think the social change we're remarking on here is the difference between, say, 1941 styles and the styles that Adam recently read in 1921. So I think that's really the social change that we're commenting on. So quite a poignant one is very early on with Hastings coming back to England after being in Latin America or South America. Here is what he says. How long ago was it that I had taken this selfsame journey, had felt ridiculously that the best of life was over for me, wounded in that war that for me would always be the war that was wiped out now by a second and more desperate war. So I think that's kind of interesting, right? That when she was writing Styles, it was very much in World War One, right? And or in the shadow of World War One of the characters is a VAD, is a nurse, dispensing nurse, and now they're in the midst of a far worse war. So there's that. We get a lot of decline of the country house and decolonization, which runs through all her novels, sort of 30s, 40s, on to the 60s, 70s. Quote, yes, I'm here at Styles. Figure to yourself, it is now what they call a guest house, run by one of your so British old colonels, very old school Thai and Pune. It is his wife, bien entendu, who makes it pay, end quote. And it really feels to me like a kind of country house run by people back from India after it became independent. So that would be, late 40s, early 50s, and very similar to the setup of the Mousetrap. So that's definitely post-war, I feel, as social change. We have the arrival of ensuite bathrooms, incredibly exciting, and bathrooms that have mediocre water.
Yeah,
Quote,
Hastings misses his old bathroom, doesn't he?
yeah, I have commanded for you a room with bath. It is modernized now, you comprehend, my dear old Styles. Yeah, exactly. There's a long passage where they're sort of moaning about the fact that you don't have a big, nice wooden bathtub that some minion has filled for you with lots of gushing hot water. And then the final one, which I did think was a little bit 1970s and maybe reflects a later revision, is on village life. So this is something we hear a lot about in the 60s and 70s, the arrival of council houses. So, quote, as my taxi passed through the village, though, I realised the passage of years. Styles St. Mary was altered out of all recognition. Petrol stations, a cinema, 2 more inns, and a rows of council houses, end quote. So the petrol stations and the council houses is definitely 60s, 70s, right? That is not from the 40s. So a bit of a mixed bag there. How did you guys read it though? Did you, in your imagination, did you think of it as more 1940s, or did you think of it as more a 70s book?
I think I kind of thought of it as almost like that that like retro future kind of feeling where it's like
Mm.
it's a bit of both. It kind of sits between, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes absolute sense.
And I think probably even more so works to her benefit that it is, it takes place majority in Styles, so you don't really have to worry about kind of the outside world so much.
Mm. I think maybe it adds a little bit to the slightly creepy, eerie atmosphere in the book because I can't quite place it, and some of them have much more sense of place.
Yeah, well, I definitely got that 40s, 50s feel. I didn't really pick up on the sort of the petrol stations bits and pieces. I remember the quote that you've talked about, but it definitely had that post-war British feel, and you could feel it was Britain on the decline. It's got a very different vibe from the country house of the pre-war Christies than and that's marked. Not just in the decline of the bathroom, all the way through it. Even with the sort of the cast of characters that we have, we've got like the faded colonel who Hastings admires so much, but who Poirot is pointing out to him is really a bit of a buffoon. So like all the characters have changed. So you see that like there's definitely that change in tone in Christie's book. That marks it as post-war Britain rather than the sort of between the wars Britain.
Okay, well, let's now do a little bit on what the readers would have been reading at the time they got the book, which is going to contrast radically with what's in the novel. So, since the last one was published, December 73, Carlos the Jackal fails in his attempt to assassinate British businessman Joseph Seif. Okay, on to 1974. We'll go through this very quickly. The Terracotta Army is discovered in Xi'an, China. The launch of the Volkswagen Golf, the only car I've ever driven. There we go. April 5th, Carrie, the debut novel by Stephen King, is published. We should do like a Stephen King. I'm amazed we've never done Stephen King in Volk, like read his books or rewatched the films. We also get the ABBA song Waterloo winning the Eurovision Song Contest. We get the Carnation Revolution in April 74, restoring democracy in Portugal after many, many years of dictatorship. We get the Watergate scandal in August, Richard Nixon announcing his resignation and Gerald Ford becoming the new prime minister. In November, In November of that year, we get the Birmingham pub bombings in England, which are very renowned, I guess, in this country. The provisional IRA, I guess, was held responsible. But the reason why it's notorious is that 6 people were imprisoned for life for committing them, but it was later revealed that it was all a conspiracy and they didn't do it at all. So it's a notorious British legal history, unfortunately.
Tragic on all sides, really. No winners out of that situation.
Nope. So. And then in November of 74, the United Nations General Assembly grants the Palestine Liberation Organization observer status. So something that's still an issue that remains very vital today. April 1975, Bill Gates and Paul Allen found Microsoft in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I've just bought the autobiography of Bill Gates, so I look forward to reading all about that. April 17th, the Khmer Republic surrenders and the Khmer Rouge capture Phnom Penh. If you want to talk about like absolutely horrific dictatorships and genocide, Khmer Rouge really is up there with the worst and the most evil of atrocities. Meanwhile, in Vietnam, the war ends with the fall of Saigon. So very sort of volatile time in Southeast Asia. June 75, the first ever Cricket World Cup is held in England, with the West Indies defeating Australia in the final, which will start a long and notorious issue, which is England never quite making it to finals or losing in the final of the Cricket World Cup. And in India, speaking of Southeast Asian volatility, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi declares a state of emergency in India, suspending civil liberties and elections, a notorious time in the Indian recent history. And finally, September 75, Home Box Office becomes the first pay television network to deliver a continuous signal via satellite by broadcasting the Thriller in Manila boxing match live. There you go.
Wow.
Yeah, isn't that cool?
I didn't know it was that far back.
Yeah. In fact, I've been kind of amazed at like how and when all satellite TV started because we just watched the wonderful film September 5th, which is about the 1972 Munich Olympics, where Black September basically kidnap and hold hostage the Israeli athletes. But apparently, this film is told through the point of view of the ABC News journalists who were in the Olympic Village because it was the first Olympics apparently where there was live TV. And at some point, when they realize this terrorist attack is unfolding before their eyes, they have to like get on a landline phone and call up and sort of barter for more satellite signal airtime because you didn't have continuous signal. So you had to kind of call up whoever was providing it, saying, when am I going live? When do I get the signal? Okay, in 3 hours, and I have it for what, 2 hours? Okay, we need to get our show ready for then. It was really fascinating to see. Any other events at the time? I mean, it doesn't really seem to bear much sort of impact on the plot, right? I guess.
No,
Yeah,
I'm good. I think you've covered everything. So
Yeah, it must have felt very weird and very throwback reading this novel when it came out, though, is all I would say. Let's get into characters and then we'll get into the various murders. So we start with Poirot. How do we feel about Poirot? I'm going to start with you, Xander, because he is your boy. How did you feel encountering him in this much diminished state?
much. I honestly felt the same way Hastings does when he first sees him.
Mm,
Because it going on this Christie journey with you, I feel like I have, through Hastings' eyes, grown with Poirot,
mm,
in the same way Hastings has in the book. Like, it is a great choice having this last one be through Hastings' eyes, just
yes.
because it really kind of hits home their long career and friendship.
Mm, yeah, it's
But yeah,
very moving
that's
when
what.
he sees him again, isn't it? And his heart's racing a little. And I wonder if Agatha in I'd love to know when which bits were written because revising it just before her death, she must have very much felt this way. Quote, "Nothing is so sad in my opinion as the devastation wrought by age. My poor friend, I have described him many times. Now to convey to you the difference. Riddled with arthritis, he propelled himself around in a wheelchair. His once plump frame had fallen in. He was a thin little man now. His face was lined and wrinkled. His moustache and hair, it is true, were still of a jet black colour. But candidly, though I would not for the world have hurt his feelings by saying so to him, this was a mistake. There comes a moment when hair dye is only too painfully obvious. There had been a time when I had been surprised to learn that the blackness of Poirot's hair came out of a bottle, but now the theatricality was apparent and merely created the impression that he wore a wig and had adorned his upper lip to amuse the children." End quote. Aw, I don't know. I think that's just heartbreaking.
well, yeah, I suppose in a way it is, but I don't know. I found this almost inspirational because, like, it's similar to when we were doing that last Marple.
Mm,
You're seeing Agatha write old, infirm people who've still got a tremendous vitality for life. Okay,
true.
they've been ravaged by time, but as Poirot comments, the little grey cells are still as sharp as ever.
My
That's
brain,
one
it
thing.
still functions magnificently.
Exactly. And I think that was brilliant. It's enjoyable reading something like that. Where
Yeah.
you're seeing a human being overcome all
Mm,
sorts of adversity. So there is something uplifting about that. Even though that in the end, time will take him.
yeah.
He's still fighting on. So I thought that was quite good in that way. But yeah, it's sad to see his decline. But also, I was uplifted by it. I thought, it's good to see that he's still fighting on. And I think, like, to Agatha's credit again, here she is. She's writing great characters, who maybe traditionally people wouldn't see as heroes. This is not
Mm.
the protagonist of her early novels. This is not, some young, dashing colonial Brit. It's, an old Belgian guy, who's like probably what,
And an immigrant.
yeah, and he's like in his 80s now, and still,
Yeah, much like Agatha.
soldiering on. Yeah.
So Poirot is accompanied by Curtis the valet. Where's George? George has returned to his family. His father is ill. Curtis is described as follows: a big man with a bovine, rather stupid face. End quote. Oh, Agatha, that's brutal. That's quite simply brutal. And then we have our wonderful friend, Captain Arthur Hastings, recently a widower, father of 4 grown children who are all over the world. Any comments and feelings about our beloved? It did really feel like a throwback. Like, I really have missed him. I know she was keen to write him out and found him constraining, but I thought it was lovely to have him back. Maybe Adam, I mean, you're in the early ones where Hastings plays a role. Do you like the Hastings psychic character?
I mean, I feel like he's like a necessary kind of like literary device in a lot of the stories I've read. I think I've read almost all of the Hastings stories, and I read the last one where he finds his where Perot finds his wife and they have their bit of their half falling out or whatever. I don't know. Yeah, I guess I could see why she would get rid of him for later novels, just because. Well, I mean, like sometimes I think she's like a little cruel to him, but also I don't know. He's like Poirot's handicap, sort of. Like he's
Yeah.
supposed to fill in for the audience, but doesn't always. Sometimes you're like, oh, come on, dude.
Yeah, and he gives
But
things
he's
away
still
with his
likable.
face. Yeah, I mean, he's just
Yeah.
charmingly idiotic, isn't he? And I think it's interesting that that interesting middle period where she writes some of her greatest work, there is no Hastings, but at the end she does end up introducing Ariadne Oliver. I think she probably misses having him have an ally to talk to, but upgrades the brain cells a little bit on that one. Anyone else want to comment on Captain Hastings? I
I
mean, bless
love
him.
him.
He's a product of his time, isn't he? Like he can't help
He
but fancy a pretty woman, and he's
he really is, and I don't know. It's again probably just reading this book, so I'm just filled with a lot of like reminiscing and fondness
Mm,
of their adventures. So I love him and Poirot. You couldn't have Hastings, or you couldn't have Poirot without Hastings, even if he's not everybody's favorite.
yeah. I even think it's a bit of a shame Inspector Japp couldn't make a reappearance.
Oh,
But
that would have been
but
too
Hastings,
perfect.
but Hastings is like, when he talks about, oh yes, and they go off to do research in Africa. They send me back pictures of the natives. Quite amusing. Like he is a product of the 20s. He's all those awful British colonial attitudes. But I think Agatha just like gently pokes fun at him. Like we're meant to see him as regressive, but like the charming old uncle who says the wrong thing, basically. Um, Contrasted hugely with his daughter Judith Hastings, who, Agatha Christie, ever since 1921, and we're now 1975, has a long line of very intelligent, bright women and women who have strident opinions and make their own lives. And Judith, my word, she's a piece of work, isn't she? This is what Hastings says about her. I had never for one moment understood her, a queer, dark, secretive child with a passion for keeping her own counsel, which had sometimes affronted and distressed me. My wife had been more understanding. It was, she assured me, no lack of trust or confidence on Judith's part, but a kind of fierce compulsion. But she, like myself, was sometimes worried about the child. Judith's feelings, she said, were too intense, too concentrated, and her instinctive reserve deprived her of any safety valve. She had queer fits of brooding silence and a fierce, almost bitter power of partisanship. With fierce brains, I mean, she's gone to university, she's a research scientist assistant. Both of them, but particularly Judith, have some pretty fierce views on how pointless, incompetent people should just be got out of the way. I mean, it's quite sort of like 1930s British pro euthanasia, pro social cleansing, isn't it? I mean, this is some pretty hot stuff with Judith. What did you all think of her?
I mean, I don't know. Part of me felt like she missed her bus on like the Hitler Youth Program or something because they were in
Yeah,
Argentina, and she was too young. I was like, shit.
it's
I felt
very
bad for
unity
Hastings a
misfit,
little bit.
isn't it? Yeah, it's very yeah, let's get rid of the Untermensch. Oof.
I
But
I think the worst part too is when I was reading it, I was trying to give Hastings the benefit of the doubt. Like, don't be so mean. Like, you can't just, think she's your least favorite. And then I was like, oh, okay.
yeah, exactly. She's very unlikable. Pat, any redeeming qualities in Judith?
No, I don't think so. I think you've covered it quite well. I think it's difficult to find sympathy with her. I think she's obviously, as you said, a product of the time that the character was written.
Mm,
So
absolutely. Okay, well, let's move on to the owners of the guest house now that Styles has become, Mr. and Mrs. Oh, sorry, Colonel and Mrs. Luttrell. We'll start off with Mrs. Luttrell because that's who we meet first. And she is quite a character. Quote, I never thought the day would come when I'd be a hotel keeper, but I'll warn you, Captain Hastings, I'm a very businesslike woman. I pile up the extras all I know how. We both laughed as though it's an excellent joke, but it occurred to me that what Mrs. Luttrell had just said was in all probability the literal truth. Behind the veneer of her charming old lady manner, I caught a glimpse of flint-like hardness. And she also affects an Irish accent, doesn't she? So she's quite,
yeah,
and she's just a mean, mean nag. She's so horrible.
yes, the comedy Irish accent as well. I thought it was quite entertaining. I'm just wondering where Agatha got it from, where she managed to produce this. She's obviously bumped into somebody who was doing this in her own circle of
Yeah,
friends. So
absolutely. Absolutely. It feels very drawn from life, doesn't
yeah.
it?
But I had a bit of affection for because as the book goes on, again, I think Agatha's characterized her quite well because you come to understand that there's a reason that she's this way. Like they've
Mm,
been married for a long time, and you know the cares of life have both ground them down, and there's a certain cynicism and a weariness, as they've been together for so long. So, like, she's trying to make ends meet. She's trying to make a living, in strange circumstances. So
And
you
again, this
almost have a
does,
bit of sympathy for her. So
yeah, it does feel very post-war though, like if this was originally written in the early 40s, because there must have been so many women married to army officers in India when it was like with the British Empire, who had servants and ayahs and lived a very luxurious lifestyle, then ended up back in England and were just middle-class housewives who suddenly had to make ends meet and had their dreams snatched away from them. I think
yeah,
post-colonialism for that type of Indian mem sub must have been pretty shattering.
and their husbands are still playing the gentleman of the manor and inviting all the guests in to have free whiskey, when they
Yes.
can't afford it.
Yeah, absolutely. Poor Colonel Luttrell, quote, he was a tall, attenuated old man with a cadaverous face, mild blue eyes, and a habit of irresolutely tugging at his little white moustache. He had a vague, rather nervous manner, and he plays cards badly. He makes mistakes. He makes more mistakes when his wife's there, and she berates him for it. I mean, it's not a marriage for the ages, is it? Or is it? I don't know.
I have a soft spot for the bumbling old husband who's at the whim of his wife,
Mm.
and especially in the hands of somebody like Christie who just writes it so fantastically.
Yeah, you just
Well,
know
I
these
think
people.
these days maybe more so because I think culturally over the years we've seen a swing. Like in media, it was like, father knows best for a while, and like the patriarch was kind of like, the bumbling thing was not really portrayed. And I feel like nowadays a lot of times like the father or like the patriarch is sort of like disregarded. Like that's kind of our cultural place at the moment. So it sort of
Mm,
feels like it's kind of swung back, and you see this guy and you have a little pity for him.
yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I think like I enjoyed their relationship because it's one of those ones that we see it evolve throughout the book as well, don't we? Because like spoilers, they're part of the circumstances that take place later on in the book, and you see their attitude towards each other change.
Mm.
And I have a lot of affection for them as a couple. I think it worked quite well. But yes, the bumbling old colonel is played for comic effect in the early parts of the book. So
Oh, I could have cried with him when she's like chastising Mo for the whiskey, and then everyone had to pretend they didn't hear it. Oh, it was just so mortifying.
That was hard.
Yeah, very drawn from life. Okay, let's move to another unhappy marriage. Styles Court seems to be a very, very unhappy place. That of Dr. John Franklin and his wife Barbara Franklin. So he's a doctor and research chemist. He's about 35. He's, I don't know if an idealist is the right word. He, quote, wants to kill about 80% of the human race, ought to be eliminated, would get on much better without them. I don't believe my conscience would keep me awake at night afterwards, end quote. And he spends his whole life researching on this particular bean that handily produces deadly poison, Chekhov's deadly poison. So not particularly a nice character. And he's married to Barbara Franklin, who's about 30, apparently quite pretty. According to Judith, she's a very stupid woman. And Poirot says, well, I don't know. I don't know. She uses her grey cells in ways that you, my child, know nothing about. So I think Poirot is indicating that she has feminine wiles. Yes, she's obviously very unhappy in marrying this research scientist who she thought was going to be brilliant, but basically has no interest in her whatsoever. Thoughts on the Franklin? Which marriage would you rather be in, the Luttrells or the Franklins? I feel like the Luttrells. I don't know.
Agreed.
They're both crap marriages, though.
I
Yeah,
don't know.
but I'd rather go.
I was going to say I think I find the Franklins one far more entertaining because watching her machinations are fantastic. She's so scheming. I think it was great. It was great reading.
I agree. Well, we have another number of people who sort of float around the Franklins. Number one, Judith, because she works for the doctor, and obviously they're far more sympathetic, right? They're both these absolutely rational, euthanasia-loving supremacists. We have Nurse Craven, who is Barbara Franklin's nurse. Quote, she was a tall, good-looking young woman with a fine colour and a handsome head of auburn hair. I noticed her hands were long and white, very different from the hands of so many hospital nurses. So she's a good-looking woman. We also have Sir William Boyd Carrington, former governor of a province of India and about 15 years older than Mrs. Franklin, friend to her family since she was a child. He's coming into a baronetcy and a big country house that he wants remodeling. And I think basically the idea is that he was probably in love with Mrs. Franklin when she was younger, but she went for the doctor instead. And now he's sort of hanging around and flirting with her. And at first, I think Hastings rather admires him, right? He's one of these colonel race type colonial figures, very dashing, man of action, and all that sort of thing. How did you find him? A relic of his time or still quite attractive as a character?
Yeah, I'd say he's interesting, but still kind of a product of his time.
Mm.
Like, it feels like a lot of this book, and again, this is probably just the tone I read it in from my own perspective, but it feels like a lot of this book is the old dying away and the new taking over. So it's always got the weird balance of, some people are too outdated, some people are too modern, some people have a foot in both
Yes.
camps.
Agree. It's very all over the place, isn't it? Because like the Luttrells and this guy, Boyd Carrington, are very much like 1950s post-colonial people, but Judith and the science people are very, I think, like 1930s scientific rationalists leading to sort of Hitlerian stuff. It's a bit of a mix, isn't it? Yeah. We have another
Yeah,
sort of
I think.
ex-army person. Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I think Christie plays fair with Boyd Carrington, though, because we start off seeing him through the unreliable Hastings eyes. He's there
Yeah.
going, what a fine person he is with his strong voice
Right,
and commanding presence. And then Poirot has to point out to him at the end that, he's often repeating stories that people have told him as anecdotes that are his own experiences afterwards. And he's actually a bit of an idiot, and like I love the way Christie evolved that character for us, and introduced that
Yeah.
that element of humor, the sort of the sarcasm into it. I enjoyed that aspect of it. I like Boyd Carrington. I like this buffoon, this bumbling buffoon, going around telling other people stories and passing them off as his own. Again,
Another
quite
reason
enjoyed
why I
it.
think this
I mean,
must have been revised because, like, as you say, in the 1920s, this guy was the hero. Like in The Man in the Brown Suit, this is the guy who was the romantic hero. Then by Murder on the Orient Express, he's a little bit stiff, a little bit past his prime, but still basically admirable. And then by the time you get to the 50s and 60s, these guys are to be mocked, right? So I think that places this particular character as being formed kind of in the 50s, maybe. We have another post-colonial figure, which is Major Allerton, long estranged from his wife, a smooth-talking womanizer in his early 40s. At first, I kept getting him mixed up with Boyd Carrington because I thought they were quite similar. Quote, he was a good-looking man in the early 40s, broad shoulders, bronzed of face, with an easy way of talking, mostly said holding a double implication. He had the pouches under his eyes that come with a dissipated way of life. I suspected him of racketeering around, of gambling, of drinking hard, and of being first and last a womanizer. He exists basically to flirt with Judith and make poor Captain Hastings very, very nervous about this nasty, rakish man hanging around his daughter, I think. Any thoughts on Major Allerton?
Is he kind of the hero of this book?
Because
I mean, like half half joking, but it's just like there's so many things happen that are so many people are. I mean, we'll get to it later, but I mean, I don't know. I guess he's not really hiding what he's about at the very least,
yeah, that's true. He does what he says on the tin, which I suppose maybe I think he's the most straightforward character for sure.
Isn't this just Agatha Christie's brother Monty being written into the book again?
Yet
So,
again.
like, we've come across this character
Was he
many
like
times.
was he a lady killer?
He was the elder brother, Adam, who basically tried his hands at lots of things, including I think the army for a while. Didn't really stick at any of them. Got packed off to South Africa, failed there. Gambled a bit, had lots of women, and died an early death. But Agatha Christie was obviously incredibly fond of him because she writes all these Monty characters, and they get into japes, but they're basically all right. And at the end, some good woman marries them and reforms them. So,
They just fail upward.
yeah,
exactly.
is very much the phrase.
and have a great time while they're doing it as well.
Yeah, exactly.
right.
Yeah, you could travel the world as a rogue back then with pennies in your pocket, as long as
I
you're
think the British
part of the British
Empire
Empire.
definitely had corners where you could hide your feckless third sons, didn't it? I mean, Kenya probably was full of them. Okay, we've got two characters left. We've got Elizabeth Cole, age 35, one of three surviving sisters, once known by the lost name of Lichfield. Quote, her movements were restless and jerky, obviously a woman of nerves. handsome in a, this is Hastings speaking, handsome in a hag-ridden kind of way. Still, she looked normal enough. It's great. It's just so horrible. A vehicle for Hastings to show his adjudication of women hasn't really come on since 1921.
Hastings
He's like, I
literally never
fancy her, but is
changed.
she too young?
What, 35? Yeah, exactly. Uh, and then last but not least, we have Stephen Norton, a grey-haired man of position using binoculars for bird watching. So this is what Hastings has to say about him. Norton, the man I had met rushing out of the house with field glasses. He appeared to be a pleasant fellow, rather ineffective and lacking in vitality. Of course, I told myself many murderers have been smaller than significant men, driven to assert themselves by crime for that very reason. They resented being passed over and ignored. Norton might be a murderer of this type, but there was his fondness for birds. I've always believed that a love of nature was essentially a healthy sign in a man. Oh, Paul Hastings. But yeah, he just
No
seems like
murderer could be a bird watcher. I mean,
yeah,
that's like
he's just
ironclad.
We do find out a little biographical detail, though, from Miss Cole, who says she's known him for a while, and she says he's very nice, rather shy, just a little stupid, perhaps. He's always been rather delicate. He's lived with his mother, rather a peevish, stupid woman. She bossed him around a good deal, I think. She died a few years ago. He's keen on birds and flowers and things, so yeah, not much to go on there. Right. Any comments on the characters, or should we get into other aspects of the book before we get into the spoiler section?
I'm good if we want to move on to the other aspects of the book.
Yeah, I think we covered them well.
Is it progressive or regressive? It's hard to know, isn't it? Because it's hard to know what time it's meant to be in. There is quite a funny bit where poor Judith has stained her finger blue because of experiments she's doing. And Poirot says to her, it is not a good thing for your husband if you take no interest in his stomach. I dare say I shan't have a husband. Certainly you will have a husband. What did the bon Dieu create you for? Many things, I hope, said Judith. Le mariage, first of all. Very well, you'll find me a nice husband and I will look after his stomach very carefully. She laughs at me, said Poirot. Some day she will know how wise old men are. Nonetheless, if you will indulge me, since we mentioned Bill Gates at the top of this podcast, one of the things I read in his new biography is a little form he filled out in school. When I grow up, I want to be. And the boys had the choices of fireman, policeman, cowboy, astronaut, soldier, baseball player, or they could fill something in. So he filled it in as scientist, but also ticked astronaut. The girls had the following choices: mother, nurse, school teacher, airline hostess, model, or secretary. So there we go. What a time to be alive.
Yeah.
Make America
As the
great
good
again.
Lord intended it, Bina.
I know, as the good Lord intended it. I mean, there's lots of dodgy stuff, isn't there, about the euthanasia and, oh, yeah, mental health isn't treated very well. Hastings finding the photos of the natives entertaining. But I think it's just all we're meant to mock it a little bit, isn't it? I think this is a case where it's not Agatha, but more the characters. But I don't know. Do you think I'm being too kind on Agatha here? I mean, she does love a happy ending with people married off, doesn't she? Let's be fair.
She absolutely does. But I agree with you that it's not Agatha, it's the characters, and she's specifically poking fun at what these characters think and say. You know.
Possibly, I think, like we sometimes we give Agatha a bit too much of an easy ride in that the characters she puts these opinions in are still highly respected people.
Yeah, I mean, it's Poirot.
You know, like and like so, like Poirot is our protagonist in this, I suppose, and you know, we're supposed to respect his intelligence, and he obviously has a great deal of respect for Hastings' daughter Judith, and this eminent scientist who believed that 80% of the population don't deserve to live. You know, so. It's problematic. I mean, I think I overlooked it as it was going through the story, but it jars a little when you think about it. Like, so I think it is progressive in that respect.
She's going back, progressive, but also conservative at the same time, I guess. I don't know. Sorry, Adam.
No, it's all right. Just going back to we're talking about when this. So this was written like in the 40s, correct?
Yes.
But it was
Basically,
published towards the end of her life.
She wrote it in the 40s when she was being bombed in the Blitz, and she just wanted to leave a final book in case she died. So yeah, it's pretty grim.
I mean, do we have any record of like how much she went back before publishing, and like did she sort of, hey, it's been 30 years, let me update a few elements, or did she kind of mostly leave it the same, or do we know?
I think there are very extensive notebooks that there's a guy called John Curran. He's an Agatha Christie expert who she had these big notebooks that she put all her notes for her books in. So you can see kind of the evolution of ideas. So there are people who would know the answer to your question. I'm bullshitting, I don't, but I suspect it has been revised just because of all the references to stuff that happened after like 1942.
Right.
So
Okay.
yeah. Whereas Sleeping Murder, which is the other one she wrote in the Blitz to put away and was published after her death, so it's the final one we'll do, that feels more like I don't know. But that was worked on definitely in the 50s. Like people really disagree about when that one was really written. Whereas this one, I think people agree there was a proper draft, like a full draft that could have been published in the bank vault in the early 40s.
Like ready
in the
to
Blitz.
go.
Yeah, ready to go.
Where did she live during the Blitz? Like, was she in London, or where did
Yeah,
she?
so she had at that time a nice country house. She shipped her daughter was pregnant with her young RAF pilot husband who didn't come back from the war, so it's very sad, and was shipped off to the country. But Agatha Christie stayed in London during the Blitz. She lived in the Isacon building in Hampstead, and she did part-time work in University College Hospital's dispensary. So Agatha Christie was a young sort of VAD nurse in World War One, which is why people loved her early detective novels, because like, wow, she really knows about poisons. Like she actually knows the chemistry because she had worked in a pharmacy in a hospital, and she went back to that. And she's at this point one of the richest women in the world. So she had no need to, but yeah, she
And
did
she's
go
still
back
pitching
and
in. Yeah.
yeah, she pitched in,
Sounds
she
like a
worked at
fucking
the
boss.
pharmacy. Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. And then
Yeah.
she would go back to her little flat in Hampstead and write through the night, and during the Blitz. And she was very productive in this time. So she was publishing 2, 3, 4 books a year, and at the same time banged out these 2 novels. One she gave, so this one I think she gave to her daughter, so her daughter would have the rights if she died. And then she gave the final Miss Marple one, Sleeping Murder, our final one to do to her husband. So yeah, she was absolutely. I mean, it's amazing actually, Agatha Christie, because she's, I think, very patriotic, like hence very socially conservative with a small c. She always did the right thing. Like even though she bitches about high taxation for all of the 60s and 70s in her novels, she did pay her tax. She didn't avoid it. She didn't go off to Switzerland like so many other people did. And yeah, she did work. Yeah, she was just dispensing chemist, I guess you would call it, during the war.
Man, and here I am still trying to get my garden shed organized.
I know, man. And she was like banging out books. And that she is Poirot, right? Poirot, whose body's gone, but he's still trying to catch a murderer. It's like, chill, dude, chill. But she's the same in her 80s, like banging out manuscripts,
Yeah.
revising these books. So
Now, as much as we love Poirot, what aspect of this is like an addiction he can't shake?
yeah, probably, right?
It's his life. I don't know. He's
Yeah.
been
But
doing
He's
it
isn't
just
so long.
he's like, I'm on to a new murder that's really complicated, and it's like the craziest thing ever, and I can't really go anywhere or do much, but I'm gonna get this one, you know.
I don't know, Adam. I think you're being unfair. I mean, what are we supposed to do when we realise that there's a murderer out there? Just turn a blind eye to it because we've decided it's time to retire and kick up?
No, but I mean, I think the
he could
difference
have
is that he's
pulled.
taken it all upon himself, right? I mean, he calls in
Yeah,
Hastings, but it's not like he's passed this off to, the next
Scotland
generation
Yard.
detective or whatever.
Well, yeah,
He's
but I mean, I think he explains that in the spoiler section. We can go into it, but like there are
right.
special circumstances around
Yeah,
his
but the
murder,
special
aren't there?
circs don't hold up. He could easily, he's so respected in Scotland Yard. He could easily have gone to chief of Scotland Yard. So they don't have all the
No, but like this,
evidence. But
I don't
these
think
are
this
things I have, I think that's
like
a narrative
this is
convenient.
yeah, it's a spoiler section discussion. This I think because
Okay.
the
Well,
modus operandi gives it away, and I'm not sure it would be legally prosecutable, really.
okay.
So
Okay. Well, cool. We'll get there soon. Let's get into reviews at the time. So Maurice Richardson of The Observer, who's reviewed a lot of her books over the decades, quote, one of her most highly contrived jobs, artificial as a mechanical birdcage, but an unputdownable swan song, which I think is kind of fair. Yeah. Robert Barnard in A Talent to Deceive less favorably writes, written in the 40s, designed for publication after Christie's death, but in fact issued just before it, based on an idea toyed with in Peril House, one of Hannah's favorite books, by the way. A clever and interesting one, but needing greater subtlety in the handling than Christie's style or characterization will allow. The characters here are, in any case, quite exceptionally pallid. In fact, for a long cherished idea, and as an exit for Poirot, this is oddly perfunctory in execution. How do you guys feel about that? I mean, that's quite a scathing review from a guy who's, one of her great, great fans.
Rude.
Is rude, isn't it?
Because, like, I can. It's definitely not, especially in Poirot's case, it's not the best novel for sure. Like, I
Mm.
could see the issues. I can see, I don't know if it's maybe because it was with the revisions too and everything, but it's not that bad. It's definitely one I would still recommend somebody to read.
I agree. And I don't find the characters pallid. Like, I don't think Judith is pallid. I
No,
think she's fascinating. And I think,
that's an absurd statement.
yeah, and Mrs. Franklin's really fascinating too, is this sort of like fake hypochondriac, sort of wheedling, feminine wiles kind of a person. And Mrs. Luttrell and Colonel Luttrell, I think, is one of the most like fascinating marriages we see. I just think, yeah.
I think this is one of the few novels where the characters are more interesting than the murders.
Mm.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that
Yeah, that's a good point.
that's definitely a fair observation. That.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we disagree. And Agatha Christie had the last laugh because, or her estate did, because this was one of the best-selling novels of the 1976 era. So, obviously people did like it. Okay, before we get into spoiler section, it remains for us to talk about the adaptations, and there is only one. It was adapted in 2013 as part of the David Suchet ITV Poirot series. It was the final episode of the final series. If you read his book, Poirot and Me, he goes into great detail about this and how he lost weight before filming this episode to show the sort of sunken in cheeks, how emotional it was for him and for everyone on set, because at this point, he's been playing Poirot for just shy of 25 years. He's very much a national treasure. I grew up, these ITV adaptations have gone on basically most of my adult life. We had Hugh Fraser back for it. It has a really good cast, including the delightful Anne Reid as Mrs. Luttrell. Yeah, really, really strong cast. Funnily enough, Aidan McArdle, who plays Stephen Norton, is also one of the featured actors in the Sleeping Murder adaptation. So he features in both TV adaptations of the final two books. It was a major big deal when it came out, when it was broadcast. I remember it very clearly, and yeah, it's. I think it's really beautifully done. It's incredibly faithful to the novel. It takes the moral questions at the heart of the novel very seriously, but it does have a very dark, brooding, sad, eerie, melancholy tone, which kind of freaked me out the first time I was watching it, particularly the character of X when they're revealed. Was very, very scary to me actually as a young person, but I think it's well done. Adam, you watched it. What did you make of it?
I thought it was pretty accurate to the story, and I enjoyed the actors. I hadn't seen any of the series you mentioned, other than like a few clips with the actor and stuff. And I did watch a clip after watching it, him explaining how he comes up with Poirot's voice, and
Mm,
watching him like shift, like, okay, now I have to shift. I have to add the French in, then I have to add the Belgian. It was very interesting to see how he kind of like made the voice, which is pretty cool, like just like on the spot. But yeah, I thought it was pretty well done. It was more, I don't know. I think it had a more dreary tone than the story itself. Like
oh,
just
okay.
everything was kind of drab.
Mm,
Yeah.
maybe they've blended into one for me.
I think maybe it's, well, it's
Oh,
just the like the color palette and all that. Like, I don't know. I just
yeah.
felt like
It's
Styles felt more of like
deliberately
a dead
gloomy.
place.
Yeah, it
So
is. It is deliberately gloomy face. And actually, even in the novel, right, people talk about, is there something in the house? And actually, even Hastings will say, yeah, actually, it was never a happy house. It wasn't really a happy marriage. Certainly wasn't a happy family because
It's a
everyone was
cursed
dependent
house.
on the mum. And yeah, sort of, do houses have atmospheres? Can there be a spirit of evil in a house? Santa, Pat, did either of you manage to watch it?
Yes, I've watched it. Yeah.
Thoughts and feelings?
Yeah, I think Adam's made a good point about how it was definitely, I found it a lot gloomier than as I was reading the book. I took more humor out of the book. I think that's probably, as you were saying, the cast and the production team were very aware that this was the final one, and they were trying to almost perform it with an air of respect that they felt it was due, and there was obviously a lot of sadness and melancholy about that. So I think that's obviously reflected in it. But I thought it was done very well, and like you said, they had an excellent cast. Always like to see Philip Glenister pop up as a character in
Yeah,
things, and I
he's
thought he did Boyd
fantastic.
Carrington really well. So yeah, no, I enjoyed it.
Okay.
Yeah, I haven't seen it, but I definitely want to now. Especially with the Poirot actor kind of going like, how you said, Bina, he's been playing it for 25 years at that point or something. So he's essentially embodied Poirot enough to accurately display Poirot in this final book of his.
Yeah.
But then, as Pat says, I love Agatha's humor, and losing that in a translation is always a bummer.
Yeah.
I think the other thing I'd say as well is like I've only really started watching these Suchet Poirots off the back of doing this reread, and I would say like my favorite Poirot is Ustinov, but
Yeah, he is great.
like
He is great.
I think Suchet, when you see him do this, because this is a very different Poirot from an Ustinov one, and there's a lot more gravitas around him as a character. And I do have a lot of respect for Suchet. I think this is one of the performances that would mark him as maybe the definitive Poirot. When you talk to people about it, there's always a debate about who is the definitive Poirot, and I think
hands down, it's David Suchet for me. I mean,
I think this is it.
I love Ustinov, but Ustinov is playing Ustinov. I mean, Ustinov is that character, right? He's just an amazing raconteur.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting to pair this with Murder on the Orient Express in that series. There's a profundity that Suchet brings to thinking about moral questions and religion, which I think is relevant here. I've just posted 2 pictures in the chat, which I'll put on the show notes for this episode, boys and girls listening, of Agatha Christie at the time she wrote the original Mysterious Affair at Styles in 1921, and then the final National Portrait Gallery picture of her taken just shortly before her death. And when you're describing Poirot as sunken in and no longer fat, that really is Agatha Christie in her final portrait, because as we know, she did love her creamy cakes. I'll post one now of her in the prime of life. Here we go, as a contrast. It's quite sad, isn't it? I felt very emotional reading this book because I felt we were coming to the end of the reread. I had watched I said to my husband when I watched the final ITV Poirot, because I've watched them all in the course of this reread, that I felt very, very sad that, I don't know, I feel very close to Agatha, and I just feel very grateful to her that she's given me so much joy. I mean, I was born after she died, so there's no crossover, but she's given me joy literally my whole reading life. And the fact that even in the middle of the Blitz, when she's being bombed and she could die and she's worried about her pregnant wife and her son-in-law who's fighting, she was thinking about her readers and thinking, gosh, I mustn't leave them hanging. I've got to leave them something. I think that's incredible. So thank you, Agatha, basically.
Agreed. And thank you for sharing it with us, because this has been one of my favorite projects we've ever done.
Oh, cool. Well, let's get into the spoilers, but I suppose it leaves me to say to the listener, stay tuned for the solution to this novel after the end credits music. And join us next time for the final ever episode of the Agatha Christie reread. It is a Miss Marple novel, also written during the war and published, sadly, after her death. This novel came out in September 75 and she died in January 76. So the next novel was published after her death, and we will cover that next time. Thank you for listening. Okay, folks, so into the spoiler sections and the clues and the solution. Here are some of the clues in this novel. If Poirot fakes black hair, maybe he's faking other stuff. Number 2, in Agatha Christie, new staff are often suspects. If you suddenly see a new maid or a new valet, they're typically new because they don't know old patterns, so they can't speak to what the current employer is doing, or because they're dodgy and have committed a crime and they're sort of trying to infiltrate themselves into the household. In this case, it's the former of those two. The character of Iago, this is clue number 3, is literally named 2/3 of the way through the novel. Number 4, for all of us who've read Murder on the Orient Express, never trust a person running away from you in the middle of the night with their back turned to you in a gown. And number 5, a big clue is that Norton is shot in the exact center of his forehead, which should lead you to realize that someone with OCD did the killing. Did you all guess who did it? Did you all guess? Well, there are 2 twists, right? There's the twist of who X is, and there's the twist of what Poirot will do as a result of that. Did either of you suspect it was coming? Pat, did you get either of those twists?
I think the Iago clue was quite heavy,
Yeah.
sort of early on. So I got who X was,
Yeah.
but I was thrown by the who actually killed X. I sort of like, when it was explained to me at the end, I was like, God, I should have got it. And I think when I did the the Suite adaptation. Like I
Yeah.
liked the way Suite had he portrayed that bit, where he carried it out, where he made sure it was dead center. You saw him doing that, and I
Yes.
thought that that's very true to it. And as I was watching, I was thinking, God, you idiot! You should have got that from when you were reading the book. That it was perfectly symmetrical. That should have jumped out at you. So,
how about you, Zander? Did you figure out either of the twists?
So I eventually figured out X. But yeah, with that final letter that we'll get to in a second, it kind of, like in hindsight, thinking about it, it's kind of all cloudy because when I was reading it, I was just like, what?
Yeah.
Adam, how did you find it?
No, I was shocked because I mean with the twist with Judith number one, and then
Yeah.
the doctor, and I was like, maybe there's something there, like maybe the twist is gonna be Judith is like a psychopath.
Where she just is.
Get it? Is
Yeah.
what I meant.
Yeah. And maybe she
But
still is a psychopath.
Yeah, exactly.
She's just running off with her fucking Nazi husband. So
Yeah, exactly. I
yeah,
remember
I
reading
did
this
not
to
expect
school.
Poirot.
I think the first time, because by this point I was Trixie, right? So I thought, oh, Judith's going to do it. Like, wouldn't that be a cool twist if Agatha Christie made Hastings' daughter a murderer? Then what is Hastings going to do? Then I was thinking, oh my God, she's going to make Hastings a murderer. Hastings, you dumb idiot. Are you going to be a murderer? That would be such a cool twist. Don't do it, Hastings. And then we find out that Stephen Norton is X, which again, that didn't seem that kind of shocking to me because, like you said, it was very heavily laid out. But the final twist, which is that Poirot himself becomes a murderer, that really shook me to my foundational core because everything I knew about him was that he was quite religious, he's quite Catholic, he believes in justice, the bon Dieu. So I never guessed it and we can get into it. I think let's clear away the Stephen Norton stuff first, then we can get into Poirot and his twists. So the twist, dear reader, dear listener, you should know this because you shouldn't be listening without being spoiled already, is that Stephen Norton has lived his life trying to persuade people to commit murder, and he gets a kick out of having innocent people then blamed for it. It's not just the murder that he gets off on, it's the fact that someone innocent has to pay for it that he gets off on. So in the course of this book, we see him tease Colonel Luttrell into an attempted murder on his wife, shooting her out the window. Which weirdly brings them together and they end up all lovey-dovey, which completely freaked me out. He then manipulates Hastings into thinking that Judith is flirting with Major Allerton and that is the love triangle that's going on. But actually, as we know, Judith is really interested in Dr. Franklin. And so he manipulates Hastings into trying to kill Allerton to save his daughter, but Poirot realizes this is happening and drugs Hastings in the hot chocolate so he can't commit the crime. The next one, thirdly, we think that maybe X is involved in the death of Mrs. Franklin when she drinks the poisoned cup of coffee. But actually, what we then find out, because Norton's really put out by this, X is really put out by this, we realize it's because his plans have been messed up and because he gets a kick out of someone being blamed wrongly. And when Poirot testifies in front of the court that no, it was just a suicide attempt, this twice blocks Norton, right? Because the wrong person died, but also no one got blamed for it because it's suicide. So what really happened is Mrs. Franklin really now wants to marry Boyd Carrington. So she needs to kill her husband so that she's a free woman. The problem is that she can see that Boyd Carrington is maybe flirting with Nurse Craven, so she thinks she's got to act now. So she puts poison in the coffee. She puts it about to people, including Hastings, that her husband might resort to experimenting on himself. So she kind of lays the groundwork, which is quite clever. The problem is that the coffee cups are on a revolving bookcase. I actually have a revolving bookcase that's very similar to that.
I also have one.
Yeah, and Hastings, the doofus, kind of manages to spin the bookcase. So she ends up drinking her own poisoned cup of coffee. So that's what really flummoxes Norton. And his flummoxation, if that's a word, should be a bit of a clue of itself. So the story ends with a locked room mystery where Norton is found shot perfectly in the center of his forehead inside his locked bedroom. But, all the clues are there because Poirot says to Hastings that he arrived earlier than Hastings, that he had a different room but changed it, which we then can deduce was, in fact, Norton's room and he had a spare key cut. And we also realised that he had laid off George the valet because George knew him too well and knew the real state of his health, and that effectively he had taken on this bovine replacement valet who would carry him around because that guy would believe he was really needing the wheelchair when actually he was perfectly capable of basically calling Norton to his room, telling him that he knows everything, challenging him to drink a poisoned cup of coffee. Norton, much like the Dread Pirate Roberts and iocane powder, says, well, do you mind if I drink your coffee? But like the Dread Pirate Roberts, Poirot has built up a resistance to iocane powder, so they both drink poison drinks, but Norton is then renderedly immobile. Poirot then wheels him to his bedroom, shoots him, and relocks the door. Meanwhile, he's knocked on Hastings' door, ruffled up his real grey hair, taken off what we then discover is a fake moustache, and run away from Hastings to make him feel that Norton would still have been alive at that point. So it's all very involved and well thought out, and a little locked room mystery at the end there. And he then goes back to his room and he writes his confession, his explanation to Hastings. He speaks a lot about whether he did the right thing morally, whether God will judge him, and then he does not take his heart medicine and so effectively commits suicide. So really there are two, for a Catholic person, there are two murders, right? There's the murder of Norton, but Poirot also commits suicide, which is a very grave sin. So that is the end of the novel. Let's get into the Norton stuff. Did you find that convincing? Was it a good puzzle to solve? How did you like that part of it, guys?
I mean, it works. It works fine. I really think it's supposed to just work fine because it's
Yeah.
not the most important part.
Yeah, it's not, is it? It's a means to getting Poirot to do something that's more interesting. A
Right.
criticism laid at this book is that what Poirot does is out of character. Like he would never commit murder. But we do know that sometimes he does stretch the law, like he's let killers off before. I don't want to spoil which book. But he does sometimes take the law into his own hand. Is it playing fair with the reader? Like, is it so out of character that we can't guess it because we just don't think Poirot would do this?
I mean, I looked up some reaction stuff from like people like to see how this was like handled or whatever by like the hardcore fans, and a lot of people are like they don't read this book or they don't like this
Mm,
book because they're just like Poirot would never do this.
yeah.
I think it's out of character. Like a lot of people enjoyed the book, but there are a lot of comments, a lot of articles and people out there that are just like, oh yeah, that one, no, that doesn't make any sense. But I mean, yeah, he does like, if he finds like a thief while he's hunting a murderer, he's just sort of like, covers his ears and walks the other way. Like he doesn't.
There
I
are
mean,
a
like,
fair few examples in Agatha Christie books where someone who's gone to Harley Street, realized they've got chronic illness, does something that feels uncharacteristic because they know their life is over. So I always reconciled it that way. Like I did feel it was a step very far and it was shocking. But I felt that he had bent the law right before and that knowing he was chronically sick and there was no way out, no judicial way to bring this person to justice.
yeah, I
But it
think that
does.
was it. The legal system wasn't going to handle this, so he was like, I want justice to be delivered, and it has to be someone, who does it, which again, probably a younger Poirot would never do, but
And Poirot, and he demonstrates this through a lot of the previous books, has no problem differentiating between justice and the law,
Yes.
and he always
Mm,
prefers to see justice served rather than necessarily adhering to the letter of the law. Again, we
yeah, that's
won't
a good
go
point.
into the various books, but like he has no problem with a higher sense of justice when he thinks the law doesn't serve the right end, as it was. So, I mean, I'm not as invested in Poirot as a lot of these hardcore readers who are outraged at this out of character action from Poirot, but it all seemed to tally up to me. I mean, what I found more difficult to sort of accept was that Stephen Norton had these powers of persuasion that would drive people to murder, just with suggestive language.
I find that very believable and credible.
Well,
There's so
yeah,
many examples in true crime history of people manipulating others to commit crimes.
but on such a scale, I mean, like
Yeah,
he's done it like half a dozen different times,
I
and
think I
he
think there's probably loads of undetected ones, but human history is littered with manipulators, both at a
literally
personal
just
and mass
drop like
scale. Yeah.
a few sentences and it will drive a guy to shoot his wife, just by provoking him. That I found harder
Well, he would have
to
been working from him
follow.
before. This is only the bit we've seen since Hastings has
Yeah,
arrived, but he's been staying there for weeks beforehand. So that
yeah,
drip, drip, drip of insinuation would have been there, I
wearing him
think.
down. Anyway, I found that harder.
I'll say it with Poirot becoming a murderer. I think it is a example of a in character, out of character moment. Kind of how you were alluding to. Being on when you're saying when somebody's got nothing left to lose, and kind
Mm.
of idea. But I also think it's both Poirot and Agatha leaving us with a final moral question to ponder,
Mm.
as she's been doing throughout these novels. Because like you're saying, Pat, with she's always had, or Poirot's always had a very distinct understanding of the difference between law and justice. And I think this is kind of that, ultimate question to leave the readers with. Like, everything Poirot did and everything he explained logically is sound and makes the most sense. It benefits the greater good.
Very
It's
utilitarian, isn't it? Yeah.
exactly, but at the same time, it is still murder. It is still
Murder.
reprehensible. It is still. So I think it kind of works perfectly. And I do think it is an in character, out of character moment, because it perfectly encapsulates his whole methodology and ideals and morals right down to his death.
Well, here, I've got a question, and it was one of the reasons why I wanted to get on this pod. I mean, Poirot's murder is very definitely a murder.
Mm.
What do we think Norton's
Right.
murder or his crime is? I mean, he's provoked some people,
Yeah, it's not, it wouldn't be punishable. I mean, like, what would even the charge be, right?
So like while we've got a lot of sympathy with Poirot, he's done a social good, I suppose, by making sure that more people don't get killed in the future by this guy. But is he really a criminal? I don't like. So I thought that was quite an interesting sort of question. I was
Well,
looking at,
according
like,
to the law, no, right? I mean, that's the
yeah,
problem.
yeah.
And yet he
But
is a deeply psychopathic and immoral person.
yeah, so like in a way, it's quite an interesting finish to Poirot's career, in that he's taken on himself to remove somebody who's quite negative to society from the, but who's not really a
And
criminal,
yet we've been
from
prepared
the
for it,
field.
haven't we? I mean, if you think this was written in the early 40s, okay, now, folks, we're going to talk about Murder in the Orient Express. So if you don't know the ending of that, please fast forward, and I'll leave a comment in the show notes on the kind of the timestamps to miss and when you can come back in. But that was published, let me remind myself, 1934. So this is written less than 10 years later. And in 1934, Agatha Christie posits that Hercule Poirot would let go a group of people for killing a man who was a murderer.
Mm.
And okay, Ricchetti properly killed that baby, right? But there were lots of deaths that weren't his fault. Like, oh, then the maid got accused and was upset and then she killed herself. Like, all of these people who stabbed him had a reason for stabbing him, but he didn't murder all of their loved ones. He murdered one or two, but the rest of them were sort of unintended consequences, right?
Yeah,
So, so Agatha Christie has quite a sort of hardcore attitude to this. And I was thinking, actually, this is written at a time of the death penalty. Like, the attitude towards taking people out of society because they're a harm to society was very different when she's writing to now, I guess. Well, I don't know, maybe not in the US because you still have the death penalty, but I wonder if the societal attitude towards this is just different now. The thing that got me more was just the Catholic thing about suicide. I was like, okay, I get murdering Norton, but then why? You're going to die of a heart attack sooner or later, or angina, or whatever he has. Why get rid of the meds and hasten it?
Yeah, again, like I was curious about that, and I don't know. Like I'm Catholic as well, but I'm not as Catholic as maybe I should be to be able to answer this question. But putting your meds out of reach so that you're not able to get to them, is that really suicide? Like, it's a very tricky question. It's
It's
good that
sins of
Agatha makes the
omission and
path.
commission, isn't it, as a
Yeah,
Catholic?
yeah,
And
but
it's a
like,
sin of
Well,
omission. Or what is it? Yeah.
and that does sound like probably how Poirot would legitify that it's not a suicide on his end. Um, but
Yeah, 'cause
I
he's going to
think
die anyway.
yeah, I
I
think it
think
can be explained. It can't be explained. It can be explained away if you are so minded to.
right,
But if you're so minded to, you can also pick holes in it. But I think I would explain
right,
it the way that you have. Poirot's obviously been able to justify this in his own mind as something that he won't have to answer.
right.
You know,
And with that too, if if he's already justified it, that it's not suicide because it's just I didn't do the thing that helps me stay alive or whatever.
Yeah.
But with how strong Catholic guilt is, because I was born and raised Catholic, but the last rites I took was baptism.
Right. Okay.
So I didn't get confirmed or anything, but
Yeah.
even in my life, the Catholic guilt, it's so ingrained deeply. It could even be a way for him to not backtrack his thoughts or commitment to the actions he took.
What would
Yeah.
have happened if he had gone to Scotland Yard and just gone to the chief commissioner, laid it all out, said, "Look, I know that there's no actual crime here, but can't you guys lock this guy up for something else? Like trump
I,
up a charge, get him off the streets,
I think it would have depended at what time in Poirot's career he'd have
get
gone there.
special
I think,
forces, just take this guy out."
yeah, I think in the 20s or the 30s, they might have just, shot him quietly while nobody was looking.
Well, exactly.
But I think in the 40s or 50s, I think Poirot probably would have been ignored, and they would have said, "No, it's too much paperwork, Poirot. We can't be bothered with it.
Yeah.
Just on your way." So
Yeah, I agree.
There is another theory. So, as you'll know, Adam may not know, there's another podcast, well, a predecessor podcast that partly inspired me called All About Agatha. And these two podcasters went through all the books, not just the ones we did, but the novellas, the short stories. And very sadly, the young female podcaster died before they got to Curtin. She shockingly had a genetic defect, and it was a very quick and sudden, very early tragic death. So the male podcaster got her mother on to cover this book because they had read and watched Christie and other detective stories together. And Catherine Broadback, the podcaster who died, had a very interesting theory about Miss Marple, the Dark Marple theory. But her mum just came out with an absolute banger for Curtin. And I wanted to throw it past you guys, which is that her mum says, is Poirot a victim of X? So, did X get to a point where he realized he was addicted to doing this, to killing people, and got very tired of doing it and wanted a way out, and therefore manipulated Poirot into killing him?
And
I like it.
but I remember listening to
But
it and
no.
going, you can put that spin on it if you want, and it's certainly there. But you're reading too much into it. I don't think Christie ever intended that. But
Agreed.
Yeah, I agree. But it did make me laugh. I was like, oh man, that would be the ultimate diss, wasn't it? Poirot is played. I can't, my body can't handle that as a concept.
But I mean, it's one of those things where the evidence is there.
Mm.
You could construct that interpretation if somebody wanted to. If Kenneth wants to do Curtin, he could put that spin on it if he wanted to.
Oh,
So
Christ alive. Yeah, he knows what he's going to do with that. Okay.
Mm.
Does anyone else have anything else to say about this book? I thought I'd read out or would get to the obituary of Poirot that appeared in the New York Times. But anything on this book before we get there?
It was a fun read, and I recommend it if you enjoy previous Hastings or Poirot books.
Yeah, I think you need the base first. I mean,
Yeah.
I'll go through more of them, and it'll probably be better if I've read more of the Poirot books. But at least, I feel like knowing this was coming up, I was like, all right, I got to get through most of the Hastings stories, which I think was very helpful. So
Good. Yeah. Oh, I'm
yeah,
glad it's
I'd agree, but I would also say I don't think Poirot is a tremendously deep character. I don't think, maybe I'm being unfair here, but he is almost just a cipher to tell the story and explain away the murder. And certainly, I think in my favorite Poirot, like Five Little Pigs, he's not really instrumental to the development of the plot in any way. He is really just a way of viewing the characters and the murder that's been committed.
he's in the
Yeah,
background a lot. I've noticed in some of the stories, like he disappears for large periods of time and just kind of shows up to tell everybody how much of an idiot they're being.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That is, he's very much like Gandalf. He's not quite there when you need him, and he shows up in the nick of time and just
You can't have him around
condescending.
Right.
often because then it's like, oh, like when a murder happened while he was in London, you're like, oh shit, it did. It's like, well, if he was there, you'd be like, why didn't he stop it? It's the same thing like Gandalf. Like problem X comes up, and it's like, well, why didn't he fix it? If he was there.
Yeah, exactly. Hashtag Eagles. In a way, we can't criticize Poirot when he does hashtag Eagles. The ending of this, he's like, fine, someone's got to do it. I'll do it. It is what it is. Maybe on that note, we'll move to the obituary of Poirot in the New York Times. A front page obituary, a rare honor for a fictional character. Hercule Poirot, a Belgian detective who has become internationally famous, has died in England. His age was unknown. Mr. Poirot achieved fame as a private investigator after he retired as a member of the Belgian police force in 1904. His career, as chronicled in the novels of Dame Agatha Christie, his creator, was one of the most illustrious in fiction. At the end of his life, he was arthritic and had a bad heart. He was in a wheelchair often and was carried from his bedroom to the public lounge at Styles Court, a nursing home in Essex, wearing a wig and false moustaches to mask the signs of age that offended his vanity. In his active days, he was always impeccably dressed. Monsieur Poirot, who was just 5 feet 4 inches tall, went to England from Belgium during World War I as a refugee. He settled in a little town not far from Styles, then an elaborate country estate, where he took on his first private case. I think it's amazing that got a front page obit in the New York Times.
But are we going to discuss what was even more amazing?
That Agatha
Was
Christie
that
didn't.
Agatha Christie didn't get an obit in the New York Times at all, but Poirot did. Incredible.
Misogyny, man. Even a flipping fake man. That's because she wasn't an airline stewardess, so they didn't know how to characterize her. She didn't fit any of the tick any of the boxes, so they couldn't do an obit because they were like, I don't know, is she a housewife? What is she? Who is she?
we haven't got the template to turn out this obit because she didn't fit any of our categories.
Yeah, exactly. Although, funnily enough, whenever Agatha Christie had to fill out her occupation on like passport forms and stuff, and this is the time when she was like, best-selling author in the world, she'd always put housewife as her
I
occupation.
know. We've discussed this in the past as
Yeah.
well. I love that about her. I think it's fantastic, and I think it's a sign of just how truly free and independent and powerful she was. She
Yeah,
could
she
just
didn't give a
define
shit.
her own terms.
Just
That's
didn't give
it.
a shit. And I think that's true, right? I mean, it's like she was so much more than that. But at the end of the day, I think partly she did it because it was hilarious. And I think partly she did it because, yeah, I'm a housewife. I like being a housewife. Like my husband
Yeah,
as well.
and maybe it was just easier at customs as well when she
Yeah,
was going
exactly.
through, and it just looked at it when housewife, okay, you're through. Whereas if she put author down, they'd be like, really? Are you really?
Yeah, exactly. They wouldn't believe it. Don't inspect my currency that I'm taking in my suitcase either. My hard US dollars in the 1940s. So there we are, the end of Poirot. A sad day, but the beautiful thing is he's always with us. I don't think I've ever, since I was probably 8, not had an Agatha Christie to hand. So I feel very, very pleased you guys have come on this journey with me. One more to go. One more to go. Adam, have you read any of the Miss Marples?
No, that was one that I was like, that's kind of gone down a rabbit hole that I'm like, I better not start that because I don't have time.
No,
I
and
read the
don't
first.
start with this one, and don't read this one. It's not one of the better ones, but I can certainly,
Yeah.
whenever you're ready, I can recommend you a good one to get you in. Very different.
Okay, yeah, I read the first couple like Tommy and Tuppence
They're like little
stories.
adventure capers, aren't they? Yeah.
Yeah. I was like, what's going on? Because I got one of those like Agatha Christie collection things that had a bunch of novels and short stories and kind of a little taste of everything. So,
There's a lot
but
more
Miss Marple,
crushing
I was
over
like,
the
I
head
figured I
in
should like
Tommy and Tuppence.
wait
Yeah.
for that. But yeah, all of the head trauma that happens in old stories back in the day. It's like, oh,
Yeah, it remains to be seen whether Sleeping Murder, our final episode's a mini pod or a full pod, because it's a Miss Marple and it's not even one of the better ones from memory. I haven't reread it yet, so we'll see if anyone wants to volunteer for that. But in the meantime, fans of Poirot who are listening, thank you very much for accompanying us on this journey, and thank you so much, Zander and Pat in particular, for being on a lot of these pods. You've made it a very enjoyable trek through 65 novels and counting. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for putting this all
yeah. Thank you
together.
for hosting
Being a
all this,
great
Mina.
host.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
And
look
the
forward
education
to
as
Mick
well.
Herron cast Pat. No pressure. I'm looking forward to having nothing to edit after the next one and just being a guest on some other podcasts. That'll be fun.
Perfect.
Okay, well, I think our output will drop dramatically without you editing them. You've been a machine with this for the last 18 months, churning out one of these every month or 2 or 3 a month. So I'm constantly impressed at how you just this will probably be posted sometime, in the next hour? It'll be incredible.
It'll probably be next weekend, actually.
I'm already commenting on it.
Well, all I can say is that if I'm going to have to do the Mick Herron ones after the Jane Austen ones, I hope the Jane Austen ones are not done at the pace you've done the Agatha Christie's, because I'll have to be prepped for early
I know,
March.
and they take a lot longer to read, right? And there's more film adaptations as well. And hopefully we'll get some good fantasy TV, right? Like, when are we going to get House of the Dragons? Is this the year when we get House of the Dragons, or is this a fallow year?
I think we're getting
No, we
Duncan Egg
get
this year, aren't
Night
we?
of the
we
Seven
get Pumpkin
Kingdoms.
Egg this year. Yeah.
Ooh, Night
But
of the
that should be
Seven
good.
Kingdoms.
I'm really looking forward to that one. So
Yeah,
Me too.
we need some good George R. R. Martin material. It was very bittersweet when I was reading, Agatha Christie feared for her life, but made sure her readers wouldn't be wanting for an ending. And I thought, George, you motherfucker.
Oh dear.
Be more Agatha. Be more Agatha.
How Vassals of Kingsgrave has changed from where it was 10 years ago, where it was like celebrating George, and now we're just joining everybody else and castigating him for not getting the books finished. Unbelievable.
No, I still celebrate him, right? And he gave me this amazing community, but he should just be honest. I wish he would just be honest with us and say, no, I've got other stuff to do. I've lost interest. It is what it is. I think it's the tease.
Yeah.
I think it's the not a blog teasing that pisses me off. Just say it. Just say it. Like George R. R. Martin is the equivalent of like, when you're a woman and you put on a bit of weight in middle age, but you still keep hold of that one pair of skinny jeans, thinking one day I'll go on a diet and I'll fit into them. That's like, just bin those jeans, give them to charity. You're never getting back in them. Just
Look,
be honest.
I'm wearing them, Bina. I'm gonna wear them.
I don't hate him. He's just having too much fun trolling the community. So he's probably sitting there with both books finished, thinking, yeah, I'm not going to release these. I'll get Paris to burn them on the day I die. And
And he's got a whole
You think
series
they're in
1,000
a
years
bank
later
vault
that he's
somewhere?
written, and he's actually
Aw.
written 10 books, but he just doesn't want anyone to know yet.
Exactly. He's just reading them. He's like Tolkien. He's sitting there just reading them himself and just finessing
Yes, I
them.
want it to be complete this time before I sent it all out.
So fantastic. Okay, well, thanks very much, guys. I'm gonna have to get off, but
I
it's
think
been
we
great.
will.
Yeah.
Well done, and speak to you all soon. Have a great
Okay.
one. Bye.
Cheers. Bye now.
Bye.
Speaking of movies, Zander. Oh, he already left. Never mind.